Hello, everyone. Welcome to the August Roundtable. I am Urmi Desai, editor here at Move Smartly. I'm with our amazing panelists, Steve Zaretsky in Vancouver, John Pasalis is in Toronto, and I'm on vacation here in New York, where they have solved the question of density problems by just allowing any building to go up wherever they want.
You're a trooper here on your vacation.
I know, filming on vacation.
Putting out the content for the people.
So a lot has been going on while I'm here back in Canada. John, Steve, let's hear about what's happening in Toronto and Vancouver markets right now. Who wants to start?
John.
Okay. The market has been, I mean, we've been talking about this on the show. It's been slowing down, and that's definitely continuing. You know, I think this is kind of the time where you need to be cautious about, you know, what kind of stats you're looking at. You know, the year over year stats are looking good. Sales are up, prices are up, you know, it kind of paints a rosy picture. But last year was quite a terrible month in terms of sales volume. Prices were kind of hitting a bottom. And really the key trend is more of like what's going on month over month right now. And what's happening month over month is sales are dropping 2 months in a row. So sales are down 2 months in a row, but when I say sales are down, it's like even adjusting for seasonality. So the Toronto Real Estate Board kind of adjusts for seasonal declines. And even after they adjust for them, sales are declining. And sales are declining and inventory is increasing. So, you know, on the ground, it's a bit of a mixed market. Like homes are still selling, you know, some homes are still getting bidding wars, but it's definitely slowing down. Buyers are seeing homes sitting on the market a little bit longer, not selling very quickly. Buyers are feeling a little bit more patient. You know, we're getting calls from people. I think we actually got a question from someone about investors or something like that.
Yes. So from Blue on our Twitter channel, actually, I think this was to you, John. What are you seeing in the rental market in terms of unintended consequences from rent caps vis-a-vis huge increase in expenses, including mortgage interest, and resulting in mom and pop selling to end users, deferred property maintenance, etc. So I think what they're asking is, are we starting to see the beginning of that listing surge that we've been expecting?
I mean, we're starting to get more calls like that. And, you know, just investors who have tons of property, you know, on the surface, you know, the rates are starting to impact a lot of people. You know, they're not distressed, I'd say, because most of them have capital in their homes. They have equity in their homes. I know, and what they're doing is effectively just deleveraging to stop the bleeding. Because if you have a lot of condos, a lot of debt, your payments have gone up significantly, the negative cash flow is kind of going through the roof, right? So you still have like 300 grand in equity in there, but a $400,000 or $500,000 mortgage. You know, you're selling that property, getting rid of that, you know, $500,000 mortgage, taking the 300 grand, putting it on other properties, right? And this is generally what we're starting to see. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it's a ton of people, but, you know, certainly some people are starting to look at doing that now.
Interesting. So some deleveraging going on.
Yeah, exactly. And again, not a ton, but we're starting to see that. I mean, which is not surprising. I mean, with rates where they are, if you're renewing, if you're on a variable at Scotia, you know, you're hurting a lot right now.
And before we turn to Steve, John, are we starting to see that listing uptick in the data, or is that?
Yeah, it is. It's not. You know, it's interesting because it's an uptick. Like we were. So at the start of the year, and Steve and I were talking about this, like the spring, we were like 20-year low plus in new listings, right? And now we're kind of creeping back up to, at least in Toronto, relatively normal listings volumes for condos, slightly below average for, you know, for houses, but definitely better than in the spring, right? And the key thing is the new listings are outpacing the sales. So what's happening is like inventory is building, right? And this is what's contributing to the slowdown in the market.
And that 1.1 million number, John, did I see that? Is that the average price in Toronto? Was what they were reporting?
So 1.1 is, yeah, the average sale price.
Detached?
1.1. No, for all
houses. Because I was going to say that's a big come down for detached housing.
Yeah, no, for all houses, and that is down a little bit over the past couple of months. You know, it was a little bit higher.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely we're seeing some cooling.
So the prices are coming down.
I mean, it's hard to slightly, moderately, like I wouldn't say there's a big drop yet, because
Yes.
it's hard to, when you look at average prices, it's hard to sort of figure out, like, that arguably kind of the median is better, and median prices are not down quite as much as averages. So
Right. But
so
for the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, we are starting to see the prices coming down, because we were seeing prices hold.
we are, but again, it's hard to say to what extent like the decline is seasonal declines, right?
Got
Because
it.
even within the year, even if prices are flat, you get sort of like these slight peaks and valleys. So
Right.
I didn't check to see if seasonally adjusted prices are up or down. I don't know what Steve
Okay,
knows.
so the
Well, I
magnitude
think,
is
John, I
not
think you
there.
should clarify, because there's a lot of people that like watch these interviews, and there's just people that literally track like every single sale in like Vancouver or the GTA. And it's like watching prices on a weekly or monthly basis is kind of a waste of time. Like it's just, real estate markets don't move in a month. Like you have to see some trend. There's seasonality to pricing. And so I know like people get like hyper fixated on like the monthly data, and it's just like, this isn't the stock market. Like, I think it's just important context. And I'm saying this because it's the same thing on the way up, and it's the same thing on the way down. Like looking at prices on a monthly basis, I think you're going to end up losing a lot of sleep over it.
Very helpful. Can I have you on call, Steve, to answer my dad's phone calls? His daily phone calls about home prices.
That's what I do every day.
All right, tell us a little bit more about what's happening in Vancouver. What are you seeing there? Is it the same as Toronto or something different?
It sounds similar, but I'm gonna say maybe not as dramatic. John is so like, you look at the data and it's like, okay, so it's sales up 28%, listings up 17%. So it's like, okay, well, how do you square that? Okay, well, both of those are coming off 20-year lows. So last July, your base effect, you had 20-year lows in sales, 20-year lows in new listings, because basically the market froze when Tiff Macklin was raising rates 100 basis points at a time. So there's really no activity last summer. So clearly things are getting better. Sales and listings up, but inventory actually down. Inventory down year over year. And so if you look at the number of homes that are available for sale on the MLS as of the end of July, it's the fewest number of homes available for sale in 20 years. So it's tough, because it's like mortgage rates are going up, 6% now. Clearly that's starting to impact sentiment, but like, it's just hard to have like a price correction when you have 20-year lows in inventory. And so right now I'd say that's supporting prices. I think if you're still looking for if you're looking for an entry-level house or an entry-level 1-bedroom condo, chances are you're competing 8 out of 10 times. I would say it's less competitive now. Like, the prices aren't necessarily getting bid up to stupid levels. And instead of 7 offers, you might only have 2 or 3. So you can see the activity. The fever pitch is definitely moderating out, as certainly one would expect. But yeah, I definitely would say like nothing dramatic. I mean, I can't draw any conclusions. I can't say prices are coming down at this point, but I can tell you that I think they're moderating. So, we roll off towards the end of last year into this year. Prices actually had a pretty big rip in the spring market.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, as rates came back down and people felt a bit more optimistic. And I think clearly as you head into the dog days of summer, combine that with a couple rate hikes, what I'm seeing is that prices, I think, have plateaued.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so it seems like not a lot of big news stories in the market. So our prime minister decided he would step in and liven things up by wading into the housing file with a bombshell of a press conference. I'm not sure he realized what he was setting off here, but I think maybe he did. So Trudeau was in Hamilton announcing a new housing announcement with the mayor of Hamilton, Andrea Horwath, when he said, "I'll be blunt as well. Housing isn't a primary federal responsibility. It's not something that we have direct carriage of, but it is something that we can and must help with." So There you go. Canada's national sport, jurisdictional wars. Here we go. So that
Sure.
set off
Steve?
obviously a huge amount of debate on the online and elsewhere in actually mainstream media as well. Just a few observational notes. Technically, the Constitution isn't very clear about housing. It's a bit of a gray area. There's some suggestion that jurisprudence around housing supply has always ruled that it is a provincial matter. But as others, including the candidate for the federal government for the Progressive Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre, points out that there are many housing institutions that are Canadian, CMHC for one, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. So what do you make of this? Who wants to go for it?
John, you want to?
Yeah, whatever. You can go, man. Whatever you want. I don't care.
I think Ron Butler obviously made a pretty good point, but I think we're all well aware, right? Which is, agree. The municipalities obviously are in the large control of the supply side of it, but on the demand side, that's, I would say, predominantly the federal government's responsibility. So, targeting record high immigration levels, allowing 1 million people a year into the country. That's a huge demand lever. They also control OSFI, the banking regulator, CMHC, your mortgage insurer, which is also responsible for financing rental projects, et cetera. And then obviously, of course, monetary policy is sort of set kind of at the federal level, but which is determined ultimately by your economics, which they control, right? Like, so I just think basically the federal side controls so much of the demand side. So to say that housing isn't a primary responsibility, I think it's just really naive, to be honest. I think it's probably something he probably wants to claw back, because I just think they just keep really shooting themselves in the foot with all these quotes in recent weeks.
Yeah, we were wondering what his ministers were doing, and then he decided to get in on it. Certainly not the most nuanced.
I'm sure we're going to get on to the housing ministers next, because I've got a few comments there as well.
Yeah, John, you had quite a few exchanges on this. What did you make of Trudeau's comments?
I think I'm going to be more mindful of the clips that I post. I think everyone with a Liberal Party of Canada membership card was all over me on Twitter because I picked sort of the first part of that clip, which to me was the most important part. I clipped off it's not our primary responsibility. I did not show the part where he said, what did he say? It's not something we have direct carriage of, but must help. Because to me, that the second half's kind of irrelevant. Because the key point, as far as I'm concerned, as Steve mentioned, and I think the issue quite here, and everyone's kind of, he's technically right. It depends on what you mean by housing. Had he just said housing supply, then it would be very difficult to, he would largely be right. The feds still have some levers, but yes, zoning, planning, all of this stuff that go into sort of the construction of housing, that would be a very correct statement to say that they do, it's not their primary space. But housing general, he's completely wrong, because as Steve said, the federal government drives virtually all of the demand decisions. We have a government mortgage insurance, government-backed mortgage insurer for people to buy housing. We have a home buyers plan, let people pull money out of their RSPs. That's federal. The federal agencies, not the federal government, they're like OSFI, CMHC, they control the mortgage underwriting. They decide if we have 25-year amortizations or 40-year amortizations. 15 years ago, we had 40-year amortizations. This is a federal decision. So it is kind of naive, as Steve said, naive and silly to say, and as Steve said, they of course control much of the demand through a population boom as well. And of course, those people need homes. So to say that they do not have direct carriage over the housing file is a little bit silly. It's kind
but the campaign too, right? He campaigned in 2015 and 2021 again on basically affordable housing. We're going to fix this. And then to come out and say, well, it's not really our responsibility, but we can help out where we can. It's just, I think it's just tone deaf, which I think it's I think we did a piece of last month, we did a tone deaf piece on the housing minister, who's Hussein or whatever his name is, about his op-ed that he wrote in the National Post saying, well, don't blame the municipalities. So I don't understand. So at one point you're saying, well, Trudeau's out this week saying, hey, listen, it's not really our responsibility. The municipalities need to step up. But then as housing minister 2 or 3 weeks ago wrote an op-ed saying, well, we can't really blame the municipalities. We need to sort of work with them and not get angry at them.
I think there's something a little more traditional going on, which is the federal provincial political football, which in Canada is a bit murky. Trudeau's announcement, he actually said, I wish I was standing here with the Premier of Ontario, not just Andrea, meaning the Mayor of Hamilton, because it's the provincial, to get more houses built. I think what's happening here is Hussein, Trudeau, and the rest are playing political insider football. They're trying to attack Pierre Poilievre's comments about gatekeepers. And really, if Poilievre's response to the housing crisis is, I'll remove the gatekeepers are at the municipal level and the province that controls municipalities. So either Pierre Poilievre is going to go after the 5 PC ministers, which right now the majority of Canada is ruled by progressive
ministers or premiers.
Premiers. But he doesn't want to quite say that. So he's never saying who are the gatekeepers. So technically, if we're talking about housing supply, I think there is a bit of a what's going on. But I think what you and Steve, you and John are saying, which is really important for us all to get, is that housing is a 2-part thing. There is demand and there is supply. And demand is very much stoked at the federal level. The levers are there. And the supply, technically and even jurisdictionally, if Ottawa tries to do something, trust me, it goes to the courts. The province has a lot of jurisdictional. I don't even know how a federal minister, from my own experience as a civil servant, would block funding to municipalities. Municipalities get their funding through the province, which they get their funding from the feds through federal transfers. So I think, unfortunately, all of these leaders are hoping that we don't know, we forgot our civic studies classes.
Yeah, and I think what's happening is, I think what Trudeau's doing, quite frankly, is actually like kind of borrowing Poilievre's comms strategy by basically downloading the blame for our housing crisis. I think Trudeau's blaming the provinces, Poilievre's blaming the cities, but they're both basically saying it's their fault. They're basically, they're actually kind of communicating and talking about housing as if the only thing that matters is supply, right? And the demand is irrelevant. Who cares what we do over here at the federal level to stoke demand and fuel demand? It's just a supply problem. And I think, but this has been the argument for like 2 years. I mean, most economists have been saying it's just a supply problem, but the narrative is shifting. At least that's what I'm seeing, that people are starting to realize you can't triple housing completions overnight. It's just not going to happen.
And that's a good point. Just too many, like I said, you campaigned on in 2015, 2021, and then you come back and then you say, well, not really our responsibility. And I just think it's just a tough look. And I think everyone's just exhausted. Everyone's just tired. And it's all this, everyone just been finger pointing. At the end of the day, it's like you've been in power for whatever it is now, 8 or 9 years. And it's just, there's only so many people you can blame. But the reality is, at the end of the day, national house prices, John, they've doubled since 2015. And so it's like, you can blame whoever you want, but at the end of the day, it ultimately happened under your watch. And so I think you just have to take responsibility and accept it for what it is. So.
Yeah, although if I were part of the federal team's comms team, I would look at the provinces when it comes to supply and the gatekeeping, because it could be made, unfortunately, the arguments they're all making have less to do with wonkish research pieces about who's actually doing what, and have a lot to do with what parties are in power. So Poilievre's going after the municipalities so he can skip over the bunch of PC premiers that holds most of the power across the country. And of course, Trudeau, it's very nice for him to sit with Andrea Horwath, former NDP leader in Hamilton, and say, I wish Doug Ford was here. It's really depressing.
But like I feel like we talk about all these things on like the show and Twitter and everything, and Ron Butler's in there and Ben Rabbit, everyone's chiming in, making, I think really smart, educated comments because they're, on the ground in the industry. And then it's like 2.5 years later, some politician will be like, oh yeah, that was a good idea, what you said 2.5 years ago. So it's like, like the foreign buyer ban, like why was that introduced literally this year, 2023 was implemented? And it's like, and then it was like 2 or 3 years ago, it was like you were considered like, xenophobic, and like that was not a cool conversation to have. But it was like, the foreign buyer problem was a problem in 2015, 2016. And it's like, it was like, what, 6 years later, we got a foreign buyer ban. That's just like,
it's optics. That's a sad thing. It's not like they're not going where the data's pointing them. And it's really unfortunate. And
the same thing on like the housing starts and on immigration. Like, I think there's been a lot of smart people on Twitter that have been pounding the table on the appropriate levels of immigration. It's not zero, but it's probably not 1 million. And so we've been having that conversation, and it's only now you're starting to see, obviously, the mainstream media really bring it to attention and to light and say, hey, something isn't working here. We don't know what it is, but like maybe we're overwhelming our existing infrastructure and exacerbating the housing crisis.
I have seen firsthand that John and Steve and others were on Twitter saying this very early and getting slammed for xenophobia, where there was none in the comments. It was just about all Canadians needing a certain level of housing, education, and health services and everything. I definitely saw, you can't say that. That's xenophobic. Now it's quite crazy to see TD put out a paper saying it's immigration. Think who are the latest ones? It's like this huge bandwagon that everyone's jumping on.
All the
Globe,
banks.
Toronto
The
Star,
banks.
the banks, every editorial. Yeah. So I know for sure our friends of Joe and the people that are worth following on Twitter were there way in advance.
I mean,
and in a respectful way, not in a xenophobic way whatsoever.
I mean, I feel like they're a little bit late to what's happening. Again, like Steve said, I mean, in this case, it's not even the government coming around. Like most of like the big bank economists are now coming around after screaming it's only a supply problem. They're starting to think, well, wait a second, maybe you can't grow by 1.2 million people per year when you used to,
what's funny is like, it's bad when like the CEO of like, I think it was like RioCan or anyways, it was one of the residential REITs in Canada that basically supplies rental housing that obviously profits off of rising rents. That was like, hey, we need to like throttle down immigration. Like we can't sustain this. And it's like, when they're literally telling you that the CEO of a publicly traded REIT is saying that we have a problem, like should be a bit of a red flag. But I don't know if you guys want to like bring up the shuffle in the cabinets as well in the housing.
Let's do it. Because I think the tone definitely is, while Steve, you're pointing out that a lot of people are coming around to nuanced arguments, I'm not sure everyone is. So as you were alluding to, Trudeau did do a major cabinet reshuffle. Ahmed Hussein, who made some op-eds and other comments that were extremely tone deaf, to be kind, like they were beyond.
I can't believe his comms team let them. They released that.
Well, yeah. I'm sure the National Post just like, rubbed its hands in glee and said, this looked amazing. And why you would go there where someone wouldn't say, this doesn't read very well. Also, we remember that Hussein got into some issues because I believe he owns multiple rental properties. Not the first minister in the cabinet, but definitely a housing minister who kind of didn't seem to know how many he owned and kind of,
fluttered. Oh, that was Talib who didn't know how many he owned, but
okay, Hussein
knew. He had like 2 or 3, I think.
He had 2 or 3, but not a great look. So Justin Trudeau moved Sean Fraser, who was in charge of immigration, to housing. Now, everybody sort of views this as a promotion. This is a sign that Sean Fraser did well in immigration. Ironically, one of those demand side drivers, which you two have been talking about, Fraser is seen as being a success because he hit targets after. You'll remember that we were actually not on pace to hit our immigration targets because of COVID. And then all of a sudden makes up the room, hits the targets, then some. The official stats on non-permanent residences are not even counted. Those obviously took off. And then he piloted this really innovative scheme to go after US HB or H1B visa holders. Yeah. So he's seen as a success on that file. So he comes over to housing. And it looks like he hasn't let go of his old file, because the first op-ed he puts out is, and let me see if I can read the headline exactly. New housing minister says closing door on newcomers is no solution to housing crunch. So is that just a back into the less nuance? I mean, that must be very frustrating for you too, I think.
Yeah, I mean, what they're really doing is, again, pulling this kind of xenophobic argument. I mean, we're not closed. No one's going to close the doors on newcomers. I mean, I don't think virtually every Canadian I speak to who's concerned about housing, who talks about our population growth rate, would never talk about closing the doors. I mean, the Liberals make it sound like it's all or nothing. You either like go to zero or it's like over 1 million, right? And I think most kind of considered people say, of course, we're like a very pro-immigration country and we want to, but you need to have homes for people, right? And then Mike Moffat, I mean, he actually put a great tweet the other day. It's like he basically talked about how the student visas keeps exploding, right? It's hundreds of thousands of people. I can't remember the number was per year, but it's growing by like 100,000 people per year. And he's like, he has a simple question. Do we have homes for people? And he's like, if the answer is no, why are you approving more student visas? Like, it's not a complicated question. And yet the, student visas keep getting approved. And I think, like, when you look at what's happening, like, and the worst part is, and what's really interesting about, I think, this discussion, and kind of like Steve said about how even REITs are raising the red flags. Most people raising the red flags about this, quite frankly, benefit from home prices rising. They own it. They're in the real estate industry. They're just concerned because the people who are getting destroyed are the students who are coming here and don't have housing, and the people who needs to rent and are getting destroyed on rent prices. So anyone who owns real estate, quite frankly, is fine with the feds are doing. Like,
and also, John, I have to say, you and Steve are traditionally, as you are real estate brokers and agents, you are people that traditionally would benefit from more immigration, because that means more sales and more turnovers and more static population. Obviously you don't generate as many real estate sales. So I think it's very disingenuous to hurtful to suggest that,
but more than just sales, the bigger thing is, since 2015, the average price for a home in Toronto has been going up by 11% per year. Before that, it was 6% per year. Yeah. So even if you're not making sales as a business, your revenue's growing by 11% per year, right? Yeah. Which and this does not even include the real estate that most people in our industry own, right? So yeah, we directly benefit from what they're doing, 100%.
Yeah. So, Steve, your reactions, you actually were bringing this up, your reactions to the new housing.
Yeah, I just, the arsonist has become the firefighter. So obviously Sean moves over there. But like, hopefully, I guess the hope is that he can ramp up housing starts the way he ramped up, these work visas and PR cards. But like, John, I wrote a piece about this, which saying is like, I don't know what he's going to do, but like, how do you get the private sector to ramp up housing starts and really, like, in a meaningful way, as we're clearly, like, as we're entering this downturn in the economy, and like, clearly, like, as a private developer, like I think almost every builder in Canada, developer, is a private company. They're not publicly traded. It's private money. When your cost of financing goes up 500 basis points in 12 months, that destroys the viability of a lot of projects, or it destroys, it destroys your IRR, your internal rate of return for the private money that you're soliciting to come in on the project. So it destroys those returns. And so like, and if you can sit and get 5.5% in a GIC, these projects are like, how is Sean Fraser like, he's basically going to try to ramp up housing starts and at the same time trying to defy like economic gravity, right? Like economic gravity says housing starts and housing construction is going to roll over. Don't really care what that guy does, but like housing starts are going to move lower. And so, like I said, to try to continue to put your foot on the pedal of immigration, I think to Ben Rabideau's point, I think as the labor market softens up, that obviously you'll see some of these non-permanent residents leave as the jobs dry up. So hopefully that will help in the short term. But I just think it's just hard. You just can't ramp up new development that quickly. It takes years and years of planning, of raising money, of being strategic, going through rezonings. And so when a project goes on pause, you don't just start it up 2 months from now. These are years and years in the making. And so that's why I think we have this healthy conversation of, hey, maybe we should consider just taking your foot off the accelerator on the immigration side ever so slightly, just until we can sort of work this out.
I'm not sure where this fits in, guys, but I'm just going to fit it in as a conspiracy theory before we get into our last segment. Unless, Steve, there is more.
I've got actually one more point. So the day that we're recording this, we actually had an article today in Bloomberg. So Sean Fraser, who was the immigration minister, is now the housing minister. The new immigration minister is a guy named Mark Miller. So he was out today saying that they're not planning to lower their annual targets for permanent residents. They're actually considering raising them, which is just, again, tone deaf. They're actually considering raising them. There'll be an announcement out on November 1st. So he says, quote, "I don't see a world in which we lower it. The need is too great. Whether we revise them upwards or not is something I have to look at. But I certainly don't think we're in any position of wanting to lower them by any stretch of the imagination." So, I mean, there you go. I mean, like I said, so if we're expecting anything to materially change on the housing debate and conversation, it's hard to see how this crisis is going to be with us.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall in that morning briefing of what the latest polls and every single op-ed in this country and bank paper has been saying in the last week that leads them to think this is a winning formula to go into campaigning. Is it a airtight room where no sound gets in? I mean, I do get the impetus is the falling, the population, aging population, and the concerns with productivity, and I think we understand that. But the level to which it's stressing our current existence in Canada is insane, and I just don't. I don't know. I wish I could be a spy. Understand that.
So I was connecting with one of our clients, kind of follows our channel. It's kind of interesting because many of our clients are new immigrants, right? And they face the same challenges. And we were talking about it, and it's kind of interesting because he said something offhand, and I thought was funny, that he used to live and work in LA. And he was talking about how like home prices in LA are like peanuts compared to here. He's basically saying, like, you get a detached home in the suburbs, wherever, like 500 grand or 600 grand. And like here, he needs to be looking at like 1.2 plus million, right? And, many are coming here for probably different reasons. I mean, the pathway to citizenship is better. Yes, we have healthcare. I think there are a lot of reasons, but there is still pressure on housing for people who are moving here, right? It's a very challenging market, whether you're renting or buying.
Final point I want to make on immigration. We cannot forget this key difference between Canada and America. Canada has had a point system since the 70s. You have to qualify very strictly, as my parents did, under educational rules. Scientific qualifications were preferred, and you would get points for everything that you did. since the 70s, Canada and 60s, and Australia followed us in the 70s. So we are two countries that use point systems. That means the majority of Canadians that come in are skilled and are highly skilled and in position to buy homes. What we forget about the American market is that most of their migration is family reunification or other basis. And obviously there's, other lower wage and kind of illegal and margins. That if you put together all of their immigration and then you look at home prices, it's like squeezing the wealthiest pockets of America, like San Francisco, New York, Seattle, and like slamming them into Canada. It's like doing the Silicon Valley effect or doing the Microsoft effect on Seattle. And I think we just don't really get that about our immigration. Our family reunification immigration numbers are way lower. It's about 70% skills based and 30% family reunification. So just think about that. That means that capital is flowing in as well, right?
Yeah.
People with the means.
Yeah.
And I just don't think they're making enough of a connection between how Canada's immigration system has been good in some respects, but is, I think, uniquely positioned to put pressure on housing. Same with Australia's.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, I see it day to day, just dealing with I mean, not a ton, but definitely, we work with, quite a few new immigrant clients and stuff. And, a lot of them were here for a year and a half, 2 years, and they're buying. And a lot of them are recently immigrated tech workers making quite high salaries. So I think what happens is people lump it in and say, well, these people aren't buying. They're only, they can't afford to support the housing market. And again, I think partially true, but I think there's also a lot of very wealthy ones. And ultimately the ones that aren't wealthy enough end up in the renter pool and they push the rents up. So everybody else has to sort of compete for a limited supply of rentals available. And, rents are a function of supply and demand. So it is what
Come
it
on,
is.
Sean. Well, Sean, we'll give you a few more weeks, but please read up on the file. No, Sean.
Sean. Yes, Sean. You're right.
I'm giving you more grace here, but come on, do better. This isn't, please don't put us back into, as you two are saying, just these shock statements as either immigrants in or not. A friend of show, Ben Rabideau, said it very well. All we're talking about is what number is appropriate. There is no cultural or other argumentation around this. What number is sustainable so that all Canadians, new and existing, can thrive and have the promise of Canada?
And non-permanent residents, to be honest, is the bigger number and the bigger strain on lower income household. Anyways, but I agree. I think they need to revisit that and as Moffat said, think about how many they should allow every year. But schools are a big business in Canada, but that's another topic.
Oh yeah, that was another. Let's get back
topic.
to this in another show. That student visa thing turned into another jurisdictional football, because it's the provinces that control universities and colleges which are allowed to give the spots, and the federal government has traditionally tended to rubber stamp a lot of these student visas based on that. And so we saw suggestions coming up on Twitter. I think Jennifer Keesmaat, former chief planner of Toronto, saying, colleges should prove they have a housing, because remember, a lot of people used to live in dorms.
But then dorms
so you've got to prove that you have a dorm spot for every person you're admitting. So let's get to that in another show, because that's another fascinating debate. Topic. Yeah, John. Sorry. Final word to you.
No, I agree. Anyways, we'll talk about that another time. That's a whole other topic.
Yeah. So we'll resume. Okay, so we're gonna have jurisdictional corner every session for a while. So we'll revisit that. But I think now we're feeling a little down, so we should end with a game.
All right.
And one of our viewers had a very, very fun and also I think interesting suggestion from an ideas point of view. From Matt. Hi, John. Not really a question, but I think it would be interesting if one of you took the bullish viewpoint and the other took the bearish viewpoint on the housing market, and you debated and pushed back against each other's arguments, perhaps presenting options you don't hold, but just as a mental exercise. Thanks. Well, thank you, Matt. That was a great suggestion. And I'm going to allow Steve to choose. Or
Oh,
do you want to
John.
argue the bull? You're the one, because behind Steve, remember, look at Steve's artwork.
He's got the
This is the
bear in,
theme.
exactly.
He's got the bull and the bear behind him.
I'll pick the bearish side, just because I think Twitter's been giving me a hard time lately, saying I'm a perma bull now. I'm a shill. Because so I'll take the bearish side this time.
Beautiful. I'll take all the trolling this month.
But I will say, I think I could play either side. I think there's actually, I think there's a fairly compelling argument on both sides. But anyways, let's get into it.
All right. So do you want to
actually naturally leaning under the bull? You don't know this.
Yes.
So he's feeling it. All right. So Steve, are you going to start us off?
I think on the
bear though.
I think on the bear side here. I think on the bear side, John, I think that, house prices are extremely elevated. We know house price growth has been out of control for going on a decade plus. And mortgage rates have gone from 1.5 to almost 6.5. And if you look at, housing has never been this unaffordable. Mortgage payments, are up an incredible amount. You got a stress test at 8%. There's no way that house prices don't fall.
All right. So I'm going to argue that it's unlikely they're going to fall. I mean, and the bull, obviously, for a number of reasons. I mean, if we look at why I'm going to use a Toronto example. If we look at why prices have declined in Toronto in 2022, it was not because of high rates. It was because people were caught in two transactions. The distress was because they bought and they sold and they needed to sell. When rates actually kicked in a year later in 2023, home prices ripped. Okay. So interest rates alone are not enough to crash the market. Will sales decline? 100%. Are we going to see some distressed sellers? 100%. Is it going to be enough to overwhelm the market like the global financial crisis? Definitely not. And quite frankly, bond yields are going to start declining way before the Bank of Canada cuts rates, and that's going to stoke more demand and optimism, just like we saw in early 2023. I'm laughing because we're playing a game, so that's kind of
fun.
I was like,
here's my whole argument.
I was like, that's a little bit hard for me to rebut a little bit, but I think that with that being said, though, bond yields dropping down, that could if the Bank of Canada, are they really going to start cutting if housing starts taking off again? I think the longer that housing remains resilient, the more of an excuse the Bank of Canada has to maintain interest rates at these levels. And so you're going to have more and more people having to renew their mortgages at 6%. And I think that's going to really start to eat into consumption, economic spending. And I think we're going to have a pretty nasty recession the longer that interest rates stay high. And, recession obviously means people lose jobs, and when you lose your job, it becomes pretty difficult to service your mortgage.
Yeah, 100%. Now, I think the Bank of Canada is not as concerned about housing. Their mandate is inflation. So I think even if the housing market is ripping, they needs to be guided just based on their requirements by what is going on with inflation and those trends. So I don't think that's going to be a factor. I don't think we're going to see tons of unemployment. I mean, the economy is kind of doing all right, quite frankly. And even if people are renewing at 6% and are struggling to make their payments, I think, and we have some history of this, that the government and the banks are going to step in. They're going to do things that they're not doing today. They'll go to 40-year amortizations on renewals, not on new purchases, to allow people to sort of get past this hump, to soften the payment shock. And we've kind of been seeing this. I mean, quite frankly, banks are allowing negative amortizations for a while. So will the government step in to avoid a collapse in the housing market and a crash in the economy because of high rates? I think they will.
Now, yeah, well, maybe they will, but do you think it will create a social unrest or unpleasantry that you're rewarding and incentivizing over levered people that should have otherwise been taught a consequence. So I would argue the politics won't allow for an amortization extension. We'll have to ultimately sort out these fixed payment variable loans where people are going to have these balloon payments come renewal time.
Mhm.
And these people are going to be forced sellers. Not only that, but you have all these investors that are sitting on these cash flow negative properties that are holding on. And I think that at some point, they're not going to be able to hold on any longer. And they're going to realize that rates aren't really coming down. And they're going to add supply to the housing market. And that additional supply is actually going to push and create the next leg lower in home prices. This is good.
I feel like we can keep going forever. All right,
John, I feel like you that was very good. I feel like, John,
Right.
you're too much of a gentleman to bring up the ever exploding immigration numbers. As some people
I
don't
know
think it's
exactly. I
great.
didn't even bring that up. You're right. You're right.
But
The bull case.
in defense of a bull market.
Honestly, though, John, like you actually made some, like, I think some really good arguments. And like, those are actually, I honestly believe that like the problem with like social media, whether YouTube, Twitter, whatever, it's always the outcome is always this or that. Like it's never in between. It's always like it's gonna have a huge crash, or like house prices are never gonna correct. And it's like I always think it's somewhere in between. Like we don't know how the policies, we don't know how the Bank of Canada is gonna evolve. Again, like they clearly haven't been targeting house prices for many years. I would agree with your point that I think this fixed payment variable rate mortgage situation, I think, is a real problem. But I truly believe that policymakers at some point are going to, I think they probably will look at some sort of extension. If rates are actually where they are 2.5 years from now, and this is actually a real problem, like I just don't think government, I don't care if it's Polyev in power or Trudeau back in power, I just don't think it's going to be politically palpable to have a whole bunch of people getting foreclosed on. Now, not to say foreclosures won't go up, they still will, but
so I think it's unlikely for owner-occupied homes, like regular homes. I think, I mean, to
for an investment property, you don't think
okay, for some investment properties. See, I don't think we're going to see foreclosures there. Like I said, I think most people who have existing properties, rentals, the majority, obviously, if you bought like at the peak, you're not doing so well, but the vast majority have equity in them, right? So yeah, they're going to sell, but it's not like they're the distressed sale who's underwater. Like they're going to sell, even if they have to sell for a slight loss, like they're going to sell. I think to me, like the bigger bearish thing that I kind of think about or worry about, and I think we've talked about this on previous shows, is more the pre-con market. Like, because the pre-con market needs resale prices to increase, right?
Yeah.
And if we, by next year, end of 2024, end of 2025, all of those pre-con condos that were bought 5 years ago that are going to be closing, more and more of them are not going to, there's a chance that they may not be worth what people paid for them. And we saw that in the low-rise market. And, again, if condo prices are not trending up to keep up with those, I think this is where potentially you have completion issues, right? And this actually happened in a lot of the US markets during the financial crisis. When people got pre-con condos, prices fell and the investors were like, I'm done. I can't close because it's worth 150,000 less. And they just walked away. And you can't walk away here. You're still responsible, but and that's kind of where it starts causing problems, right? Like you can't just walk away from the purchase. The builder can sue you. So
yeah, I mean, I would agree to that point, which is funny because if you think about the knock-on effects of that, like playing 100%. Your bull bear case again, it's like very true. I definitely think there's gonna be some issues in the pre-con space, but it's funny because if you think further out, you're like, well, hold on a minute. We need the investors to actually come in and buy pre-sale units to actually get these buildings constructed, because the banks are typically wanting 60, 65, 70% of your building pre-sold in order to obtain financing. And so if the investors aren't around, well, then you're not launching new projects, but your immigration minister is telling you we're not letting our foot off the gas
Mhm.
on new immigrants. And so you're kind of in this catch-22.
Yeah.
Which is it's just, so it's like, it's never like, I don't know, it's hard to kind of square about how this is all going to play out.
I think that for me, the pre-con thing, and again, we don't know what's going to happen. We might not have an issue. You know, I think it becomes a bigger issue if condo prices fall or stay flat between now and the next year and a half. But to me, that's the massive risk because there's nothing the government can really do. You know what I mean? Like all the other stuff that we talked about, like mortgages, household stress, they can extend AMs, they can do things to help those people, right? And they don't want to see people lose their homes. So
mortgage deferrals,
mortgage deferrals, you know what I mean? Like, so that's why I don't think that's going to be where like there's going to be massive issues, because even if there are cracks, the feds will step in. But when you're talking about like pre-construction condos that were bought that are not worth what people paid for them, what the government's not stepping in, man. Like if you're an investor, you're out, you know? And I think that's,
you should put an asterisk too next to that because Twitter will love that, which it says, if you have a fixed payment variable, do not rely on this video to assume you're getting a bailout.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't assume you're going to get a 40-year AM. I'm saying I think there's a possibility of it if there is actually genuinely enough stress.
Yeah.
Across the market that on a case, I mean, we're already seeing it, right? It's already happening, you know, as Ron talks about a lot, it's already happening on a case-by-case basis where people are going back to the banks and saying, listen, I can't raise my payment. We got to work this out in the banks on a case-by-case basis. If you can show hardship, they are already extending your amortizations.
Guys, I think you're on solid ground, even with the Twitter mob. It was astounding to see Canadian banks operate the way they did, even in advance of that the federal budget announcement that extended amortizations, including negative amortizations, were going to be allowed. So I think you're on some solid ground that we've already seen some unprecedented moves when it comes to keeping people in their homes on the parts of the federally regulated.
I think we've already seen a story, which is like you saw it in the pandemic, which was like mortgage deferrals. 18% of people won. 18% of mortgages in Canada were deferred at one point. And like, I'm not saying that's a good policy. I actually think it creates a lot of moral hazard, but I think these people have already shown their cards. And you saw it during 2008, 2009. There was the Canada Mortgage Bond Program there. John, what was it called?
Oh, I know. I can't remember that. Yeah.
Anyways, they basically packaged up a whole bunch of mortgage bonds and ensured that ensured the banks were able to keep lending to support the home prices. And so, yeah, there's just been a lot of manipulation, into the housing market, whether you're liberal or conservative. It's been both parties, I'd say, that have made housing a priority.
Yeah, and note those are federal levers. So I want the audience to show that John and Steve are so fair-minded that halfway through this debate, they kind of cross floors. And now I'm hearing both of them are kind of bearish on pre-con, bullish for the reasons that they've discussed, out of control drivers on the demand side, primarily on the other side, as well as the institutional willingness to keep people in their homes. So I'm going to summarize your debate that way.
Nice.
I'm going to say Steve and John are not saying to plan your whole life around what they're saying, but I think a lot of what they're saying is look at what these institutions, these politicians, these governments have been willing to do so far, right? They're telling you who they are. So pay attention. And that, if you guys, I don't know who to award the winner. You just kind of converged in the middle.
No winner. There was no clear winner.
There was no clear winner. The draw.
But you guys brought me back to the conspiracy I wanted to bring up. Is anything, John, there's been a lot of stories about new, and I shouldn't be laughing because this is horrible, but pre-con developments going up in flames in the GTA.
Man, we literally don't have that in Vancouver. I don't think there's one that's caught fire. So the conspiracy is that
are some builders not able to sell the remaining units at the prices they want? Any?
I don't know. You're right. There've been a lot of them. It seems very odd. Low rise projects, I believe all of them. So I don't know what's going on there, but yeah, I've been noticing that as well. Anyways,
so unprecedented Canadian
show.
fire season. Yes, on many fronts. We said nothing and we impugned no one.
There you go.
All right. That was really good. It was a really full agenda, and next month we'll be back with some of the other topics. Please keep your questions coming. You can reach John on Twitter. I'm still calling it Twitter, at John Pasalis, Steve at Steve Zaretsky. You can reach me at Move Smartly, and also editor@movesmartly.com if you have any feedback on the show. Thanks for helping me do this from New York, guys. It wasn't my usual self.
No, it's really good.
A little bit more freewheeling today. So thanks
Awesome.
Thanks a lot. And thanks to all of you for joining and listening to us.